Let's step back for a moment. When we think of the Dark Ages, the mind conjures up knights on horseback, castles looming over muddy villages, and peasants laboring in fields. But hidden in the shadow of those castles, down in the basements, beneath the towers, behind wooden doors banded with iron, was another world. A darker world. A world that was less about gallantry and more about survival. This was the world of the medieval prison. Now, let's get one thing clear from the beginning. Medieval prisons were not prisons in the modern sense. There were no large state-run correctional facilities with carefully divided cells, no long corridors of barred doors like we picture from movies. Instead, prisons in the Dark Ages were often improvised, uncomfortable, and cruel. They weren't built for rehabilitation. They weren't even really built for punishment in the way we understand it today. They existed for one primary reason: containment, to hold a person until their fate was decided. And that fate was rarely kind. Imagine being accused of theft or failing to pay your debts or offending the wrong noble. You wouldn't necessarily be sentenced to 5 years in prison. That concept didn't exist. Instead, you were locked away to await trial, or ransom, or in many cases, execution. Prison was often just the waiting room before something worse. So, what did these prisons actually look like? The first thing to understand is that they were not always separate buildings. More often, they were spaces repurposed for confinement. A dank cellar beneath a castle, a small chamber inside a town gatehouse, a tower room with a single barred window. Sometimes even a pit dug into the earth with wooden planks covering the top. Anything that could restrain a body could be called a prison. Stone was the most common feature. Cold, unyielding stone. Just like in castles, stone absorbed the dampness of the earth and held it for days. Step inside such a chamber and you would feel the chill rise instantly from the floor into your bones. There was no insulation, no warmth, just rough stone walls oozing moisture and a heavy iron door that closed with a sound like finality itself. And if you were unlucky enough to be thrown into a dungeon, that word itself comes from the Old French donjon, meaning the main tower of a castle. You were descending into a space designed less for human habitation and more for the simple task of keeping you in. Dark, airless, windowless. Many were below ground level. Some had no light at all, except what filtered through cracks in the ceiling. The air was thick with mildew and rot. The ground was either bare stone or dirt mixed with whatever had been left behind by the last unfortunate soul. It wasn't just the physical environment that made these places terrifying. It was the uncertainty. You never knew how long you'd be there. Days, weeks, months, years. And you never knew what awaited you once the door finally opened. But let's take a closer look at the structure itself. If we were to walk into a Dark Age prison, if we can even use the word walk, since some of these entrances required ducking through low arches or descending rickety ladders, we would notice the simplicity. A bare chamber, often with chains fixed into the walls or the floor. Rings of iron where shackles could be attached. In larger towns, there might be multiple chambers, each with a different function. One for debtors, one for accused criminals, one for the especially dangerous or politically important. But in most rural areas, there was no such luxury. Everyone was crammed together. The smell would hit you first. A blend of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and human waste. Remember, there were no toilets. Prisoners relieved themselves in buckets, if buckets were provided. Otherwise, they used the corners. Over time, the stench grew unbearable, and disease spread quickly. Noise was another feature. Chains rattling as people shifted in the dark. Whispers of prayers, cries of pain, arguments, pleas to guards who didn't listen. And in the background, the dripping of water, the scratching of rats, the creak of doors that opened only when someone was being taken away. And yet, for all this bleakness, prisons weren't always places of constant misery. Some prisoners, especially the wealthy, could negotiate better treatment. They might pay guards for food, blankets, or even private rooms. A nobleman imprisoned in a castle tower might still have his servants bring him meals, wine, and betting. For him, confinement was more about restriction of freedom than physical suffering. But for the poor, the ordinary, the nameless, prison was nothing less than a descent into purgatory. Food was minimal, bread if available, gruel often watered down, sometimes scraps thrown in with little regard for whether they were edible. Water, often unclean, carried in wooden buckets that themselves were never washed. Malnutrition was common. Scurvy, weakness, infections, these spread rapidly. Clothing offered little protection. Whatever you were arrested in was what you wore, sometimes for months. If your clothes rotted or were stolen by rats, you endured the cold half-naked. Blankets were rare. Fires were almost never allowed in underground chambers. The idea wasn't to make prisoners comfortable. The idea was to keep them alive just long enough to face judgment. Now, let's pause and think about this contrast. In a world where nobles feasted in candlelit halls just a few feet above, below them, prisoners shivered in darkness. One floor separated banquets from despair. Stone walls that protected kings and lords also trapped thieves and beggars. Safety for some, misery for others, all contained within the same architecture. And then there was the matter of justice. In the Dark Ages, justice was not blind. It was heavily tilted by wealth, status, and influence. A nobleman accused of a crime might be placed in a chamber with windows, a bed, and food, while a peasant accused of stealing bread might rot in a dungeon with shackles on his ankles. The same word, prison, applied, but the experiences were worlds apart. Still, prisons were not meant to hold people indefinitely. They were transitional. You were there until something happened. Trial by jury, trial by ordeal, trial by combat, or the payment of ransom. This meant that prisons were less about long-term incarceration and more about suspense. You waited, and waiting was often worse than the punishment itself. Hours dragged into days, days blurred into weeks. In the darkness with no sunlight, no way to track time, prisoners lost sense of day and night. Some hallucinated. Others fell into despair. Voices carried strangely in stone chambers, sometimes making it sound like whispers were coming from the walls themselves. For those isolated in solitary confinement, silence could become unbearable. And yet, despite all this, there was a strange normality to it. Medieval society accepted prisons as part of life. Everyone knew someone who had been locked away. Debt, theft, rebellion, these could land almost anyone behind those walls. The fear of imprisonment was real, but so was the acceptance that it was woven into the fabric of the times. But prisons were not static. Over the centuries, they changed. From crude pits to more organized facilities, from castle dungeons to town jails, from arbitrary holding pens to places that reflected evolving ideas of punishment and justice. And to understand what prison life really looked like, we have to move deeper, beyond the walls, into the daily reality of those who lived there. The cold, the hunger, the disease, the chains, and the silence of nights that seemed endless was often broken not by comfort, but by suffering. For in the Dark Ages, prison life was not designed to ease a soul through its sentence. It was designed to wear that soul down, to hold it in suspension, to remind it that freedom was no longer its own. Imagine lying on a bed of damp straw. At first, perhaps, it feels like relief compared to the cold stone floor. But over days, the straw molds, it compresses, it scratches your skin. It smells of rot and rats. Soon, the straw itself becomes an enemy, crawling with lice and fleas. Prisoners itch constantly. Skin infections spread. Open sores were common. The body became a map of scratches, rashes, and scars, all gifts of the cell. Food was little better. The word meal almost feels too generous. Guards brought what was cheapest and easiest, hard bread that could crack teeth, watery gruel, sometimes just vegetable peels boiled into a thin soup. If you were lucky, a chunk of cheese. If you were unlucky, nothing at all for days. Water was often drawn from local wells or cisterns that were already contaminated. Dysentery was a constant companion. A prison could become an outbreak waiting to happen, where one sick body infected a dozen more. But here is where inequality showed itself most clearly. Wealthier prisoners, nobles, merchants, or anyone with influential family could bribe their way to comfort. A guard's loyalty was cheap. A few coins could secure fresh food, warm bedding, even a small fire in the chamber. Some prisoners dined better than the gaolers themselves. Others lived like ghosts, their ribs showing, their voices fading to whispers. Prison life in the Dark Ages was as much about money as it was about crime. And then there were the chains. Shackles were common, heavy iron cuffs clamped around ankles or wrists. Some were fastened to walls, others were attached to iron rings set into the floor. Movement was limited. The skin beneath the iron often blistered and broke, infections creeping in. The rattle of chains was constant, a background music of suffering. Even in the dark you could tell when someone shifted or turned, the sound carrying through the chamber like a reminder that no one was free. Now let's talk about the rules of justice. In the Dark Ages, truth was not always established by evidence. Sometimes it was established by ordeal. You might be pulled from your cell not to face a jury, but to face fire, or water, or combat. Trial by fire meant carrying hot iron a certain distance, with innocence declared if your burns healed cleanly. Trial by water meant being thrown into a river or pond. If you sank, you were considered innocent. If you floated, guilty. And trial by combat, of course, meant fighting your accuser or a champion in single combat. Win, and you were free. Lose, and your prison stay ended permanently. For many, the wait for these ordeals was worse than the ordeal itself. Days of anticipation, knowing that your future depended not on truth, but on chance, superstition, or strength. Prison wasn't just about the body, it was about the mind, gnawed by fear and uncertainty. And what of torture? Yes, it was real. Prisons were not always built with torture chambers, but castles often had them, and interrogation was a central part of imprisonment. Torture was not always about extracting truth, it was about breaking the will. Racks, thumbscrews, the strappado, these devices made appearances across Europe. Sometimes the threat was enough. The sound of screams echoing down a stone corridor could make even the innocent confess, simply to make the pain stop. But we must not imagine that every prisoner was chained and tortured. More often, suffering came in smaller, subtler forms. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, the dripping of water at night, the scratching of vermin, the hopelessness that crept in when days blurred into one another. Prison was not always loud. Sometimes it was worse when it was quiet. And yet, for some, prison was not the end of life, but the continuation of politics. A captured knight or noble might be held for ransom. His family would negotiate his release, sometimes for gold, sometimes for land. These men lived in confinement, yes, but with cushions, food, servants even. Their prison might be a tower chamber with a view of the countryside. Meanwhile, in the same fortress, commoners rotted in darkness below. The word prisoner applied to both, but their experiences could not have been more different. Disease thrived in these conditions. Tuberculosis, fevers, dysentery, plague, all found fertile ground in crowded, unwashed cells. Many prisoners died not from sentencing, but from infection. Corpses were sometimes left in cells until they were removed days later, the air filled with the smell of decay. Survival rates were low, especially for the poor. And still, humanity persisted. Prisoners prayed. They carved small marks into the walls to keep track of days. They whispered stories to each other in the dark. Some sang hymns, their voices trembling but steady. Even in despair, people sought connection. The human spirit clung to hope, even when the body was failing. Now imagine the guards. They were not always cruel tyrants. Some were just men doing a job, often poorly paid, sometimes brutal, sometimes indifferent. Their own lives were harsh. They might sell favors for coins, smuggle letters, or turn a blind eye to escapes. Others, of course, embraced cruelty, taking pleasure in the power they held. For a prisoner, every day depended on which kind of guard stood watch. And there was yet another irony. While prisons were meant to restrain, they were also insecure. Escapes were common, locks were crude, walls crumbled, guards were bribed, tunnels were dug. Many a prisoner vanished into the night, some to freedom, others only to be captured again. But for those who stayed, the rhythm of prison life was simple. Hunger, cold, waiting. Waiting for ransom. Waiting for ordeal. Waiting for a guard's footsteps. Waiting for a door to creak open. Waiting for a verdict or for death. And in that waiting, time itself became distorted. A single night could feel like eternity. A single week could feel like years. The silence was endless but not empty. It was filled with fear, with coughs, with prayers, with the gnawing sound of rats in the straw. So, what did prison life look like in the Dark Ages? It looked like survival reduced to its rawest form. Food, warmth, breath, nothing more. But to truly understand it, we need to go deeper still. Beyond the general descriptions, into the stories of individuals. The nobles held for ransom, the rebels shackled in darkness, the nameless peasants who died unrecorded. Because in their stories we find not only the misery of prison, but the strange ways in which it reflected society itself. And the strange ways in which it reflected society itself can only be seen when we look closer, not just at the stones and chains, but at the lives caught within them. For a prison is not a building. A prison is its prisoners. Take, for example, the noble hostages of war. A captured knight or baron was often more valuable alive than dead. He might be confined in a castle chamber, guarded but not tormented, given meals, sometimes even the company of servants. His prison was not straw on the floor, but a feather mattress behind locked doors. He waited not for torture, but for ransom negotiations. His suffering was measured in boredom, in loss of freedom, in uncertainty about whether his family could pay the demanded price. For him, prison was a chess move in a larger game of politics. Now contrast that with the debtor. A man who owed money to his lord or neighbor could be confined indefinitely, not because he was dangerous, but because he was poor. Debt prisons were common in medieval towns. Entire families could be held together in cramped spaces, children included, their only crime being unpaid coins. They lived on scraps, sometimes surviving only because relatives or charitable townsfolk sent food through the bars. For them, prison was not temporary. It was life suspended, a punishment for poverty itself. Then there were rebels, those who challenged authority. For them, prison was rarely long. They were confined only until a gallows was prepared or an executioner summoned. Their time behind walls was brief but brutal, filled with beatings, mockery, and the knowledge that each sunrise brought them closer to death. And what of women? Yes, they too were imprisoned, sometimes for theft, sometimes for witchcraft, sometimes for nothing more than defiance. Women's prisons were not separate institutions. They were often simply chambers within existing jails, less secure, less supervised, which brought their own dangers. Pregnant women gave birth in chains. Children grew up in cells. Stories whisper of infants crying in the dark, their mothers powerless to comfort them. Prisons, then, were mirrors of the world outside. They reflected the same hierarchies, the same inequalities, the same cruelties. Wealth bent the rules. Poverty bore the brunt. Gender defined vulnerability. Status determined survival. A prison was not a place apart from society. It was society, distilled and stripped bare. And yet, within this bleakness, small acts of humanity flickered. Monks sometimes visited prisoners, bringing bread, water, or prayers. Religious orders, especially in later centuries, took pity on debtors, raising money to free them. Some jailers allowed families to visit. Letters were smuggled in and out. A whispered conversation at the bars of a cell could bring hope where there was none. Still, escape was always the dream. Stories abound of daring flights, prisoners sawing through bars with smuggled files, bribing guards with hidden coins, disguising themselves as beggars or servants. Some succeeded. Many failed. The attempt itself was a gamble, freedom or death. And even in success, a fugitive was rarely safe. Laws followed them. Memories of their crime trailed them. Freedom was fragile. So what, then, did prison life mean in the Dark Ages? To us, it looks like cruelty. To them, it looked like order. It was not about justice as fairness, but justice as deterrence. The sight of prisoners behind bars reminded townsfolk what awaited them if they defied the rules. The stench of the dungeon drifting into the streets was itself a warning. In a world where law was shaky and survival uncertain, fear was a tool as valuable as the sword. And this is where the story of medieval prison life becomes almost paradoxical. For while prisons crushed individuals, they strengthened authority. Each chained body was a message that the Lord was powerful, the town law was firm, the church watched from above. In this sense, the prison was not merely a building of confinement. It was a theater of power. But the centuries moved on. Slowly, the idea of imprisonment shifted. By the late Middle Ages, towns began to build jails, purpose-built jails with multiple cells, guards, and records. The concept of long-term incarceration as punishment began to take root. It was no longer just about waiting for ordeal or execution. It was about time itself as punishment. But in the Dark Ages, before this evolution, prison remained what it had always been, limbo. And limbo is perhaps the right word. Not quite life, not yet death. A place where time stood still. Days without sunlight. Nights without stars. Hours without meaning. Prisoners became shadows of themselves, their stories often lost, their names forgotten, their bones sometimes buried in unmarked pits outside the walls. Yet, even in this limbo, we find echoes of resilience. A prayer carved into stone, a tally of days scratched with fingernails, a crude drawing of a cross or a bird etched by someone who longed for the sky. These small marks, barely visible centuries later, remind us that even in despair, the human spirit resisted silence. So, what did prison life actually look like in the Dark Ages? It looked like cold stone walls that sweated with damp. It looked like straw beds that rotted beneath bodies. It looked like chains that bruised skin and meals that starved more than they fed. But it also looked like whispered prayers, desperate bargains, fleeting hopes. It looked like humanity reduced to its rawest form, stripped of comfort, left with nothing but endurance. And here is the final irony. Medieval prisons, brutal as they were not built to destroy humanity. They were built to control it. Yet, in that very attempt, they revealed humanity's strength. For while many died, many also endured. They endured hunger, cold, chains, and despair. They endured days that seemed endless and nights that were worse. And in enduring, they left behind lessons. Lessons about power. Lessons about inequality. Lessons about survival. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, safe beneath blankets, the hum of modern life around you, remember this. Not so long ago, sleep itself was a privilege. Warmth was a luxury. Freedom was a dream. And in the Dark Ages, prison life was not just a sentence. It was a reminder, etched in stone, whispered in darkness, that comfort is never guaranteed and survival itself is sometimes the only victory.